Hello everyone and welcome to Flynet's presentation on reducing terminal emulator TCO. My name's Rhiannon Dakin. I am Head of Marketing at Flynet. I'm also quite heavily involved in our pre-sales and our sales and account management for the teams here so that I get a good idea of what our customers need and the kind of challenges that everyone's facing with their terminal emulator total cost of ownership. So what we're going to look at now is how to reduce that cost of ownership without sacrificing security or performance. So at the moment, as I'm sure you're all aware, we've got quite a drive to reduce costs in all elements of the IT budget. That's coming from a lot of different areas. It's coming from the macro climate, so inflationary pressures across the business, squeezing that IT budget. We've got a lot of historical budgeting in IT, so the cost that was available to do all of your activities last year may not be quite stretching as far this year, so we're looking to make some savings there. And we've also got a change in working practices that the IT department has been expected to kind of absorb. So whether that's new devices, increased VDI load, extra cloud services, extra security hardening that people are putting in place at the moment. There's a lot of cost pressures and we are going to help you figure out how we can deal with those and get the most out of your terminal emulation. So why is terminal emulation in particular under fire? The thing about your emulator is it's quite a silent part of the business. So if it's working well, no one really knows it's there. You see your applications on your desired device, connect as you usually would. It's all branded as per the application. No one really knows how you're getting there. So when faced with the bill for it, a lot of times people don't really appreciate the value that that's bringing to the business. On the flip side of that, we also have it's incredibly business critical. So whilst it may be hard to explain the value of your terminal emulator, people would soon realize if it was turned off. So in this webinar, we're actually going to look at the total cost of ownership, which is something that's quite rare. So rather than just the line item for your terminal emulator, we're going to look at what it actually costs your business and the knock-on effects it can have in other elements of your IT budget. So we're going to look at the initial software purchase and subscription, the associated professional services, support and maintenance fees, internal administration and support, any additional supplementary licensing that might be required and often is, the hardware, hosting and virtual desktop costs that could come with some emulators. We're going to look at audit exposure, security exposure, impact on insurance and SLA, as well as productivity and revenue potential. So all areas that your terminal emulator will directly impact in your budget and how we can reduce those all to the minimum possible while ensuring optimum performance and good return on your investment. So the first thing that most people look at is the initial software cost and the associated maintenance and services. So that has a number of elements. You've got the first and foremost, the actual licensing model. So that's how the emulator is licensed, whether that's by named user or whether that's concurrent session licensing. Now, which one's best for your business? There's no one right answer. It depends on your usage pattern. So if you have your emulation users that are shift-based, or very occasional users, so say they go on, for example, to check a piece of inventory, load up the terminal emulator to check that, to do maybe a quick 5-minute account onboarding once a day, very occasional low risk, low intensity users, I would recommend a concurrent session licensing model. So it could be a really cost effective thing that would allow many users to share those concurrent sessions. If, however, you've got really high users, very common in call centers, that might have 3 or 4 sessions open at once throughout the entire of their day to check customers' accounts, to onboard customers, to look in to check order statuses for, and that's their job, absolutely try and go for a named user model. You'll get a lot more out of that. Equally, when you're looking for a terminal emulator, it's worth seeing whether the vendor that you've chosen has different levels of emulator. So many vendors will have like a light or a curtailed version. Now that could just be things not including maybe file transfer or multi-host options, for example. So if you've only got mainframe or IBM I, you don't really need to have an emulator that also connects to VMS, for example, you need to be paying that premium. So see if there's options to reduce your feature sets so that it's tightly aligned with what you need from your emulator, while still having those TLS 1.2, 1.3 standards of security, not sacrificing on those. It's a really good way to cut costs, and see if you can do it that way. It's also worth seeing whether the maintenance is included or whether that's extra, and seeing what the percentage fees are. Some vendors will offer perpetual licensing, but that can be quite costly, and with your initial capital expenditure, and have a maintenance fee which is actually comparable to a lot of subscriptions. So a subscription model may be favourable in those instances. It's also worth looking at whether the new releases are included or whether they are additional extra, and whether the releases that are necessary to comply with all your security requirements are going to be included in that subscription. It's worth looking at what the average rate of increase is that the vendor has had. So if you're looking to switch vendor, before you do that, always in the procurement process, just ask what their average increase is over the last 3 years. That should give you quite a good benchmark. If you want to insulate your business and give yourself some security, best time to negotiate those buy forwards and multi-year commitments are at renewals. Always ask the question. I always encourage it of my clients. Ask questions regarding buy forwards and multi-year commitments. Vendors like that kind of security, so it can be a real win-win on that, and you can get some quite good discounts. So deployment method and impact on cost. So not all emulators are created equal in terms of their deployment costs. So you've got client-based emulators, I'm sure you're all aware, which are installed directly on the access devices. And you've got server-side emulators or web-based emulators that are installed on a web server or in the cloud, and then accessed from each access device using a URL. Now, which emulator choice you have, if you have a choice, because some people won't, but if you have got a choice, they are going to have different impacts on areas of your IT budget outside of that terminal emulation cost. So you've got the cost of administration. So if you've got a client-side emulator, they can be more costly to administer, because obviously you have to have somebody talk the user through the process of installing it on the access device. As well, you have to have someone remote desktop in if you have an issue, you can't centrally administer the sessions. So that can cause an administration burden that in some organizations can significantly outweigh the potential benefit of a lower cost per seat emulation license. It's also worth looking at your client access device requirements. So some emulators will require you to have certain browsers or certain devices, or prohibit you using more cost-effective devices. For example, some emulators won't run on Chromebooks, which can be a really cost-effective device for in general as part of your IT budget. So always worth looking at that. Also, the VDI bandwidth used by your emulation, and whether you can take that out of the payload and just put it directly into onto a web server so you can access it through the browser and get it off that payload. And also, how many servers are required to run your emulation. It's really variable between vendors. Some vendors can support thousands of concurrent sessions through a minimum spec Windows VM. Others maybe 200. So when you're looking at clients with 10,000 users, that really does make quite the difference in the total cost of that solution. As well as looking at additional licenses. So some terminal emulators rely on Java componentry, which does give you an extra cost, and some mandate that you use versions of Windows that are under paid extended support plans. So always worth checking and asking those questions to see whether you can reduce cost in those areas as well. Then we're going to get into audits. So this is something that very, very few people take into account when procuring their terminal emulator, because they assume that this is not going to apply to them, but unfortunately all too often it does. So as we've spoken about, there's often historical budgeting, and that will not take into account a hefty audit bill. and they can be hefty. You only have to look it up in the news. Terminal emulation audit, just have a little Google on news articles on that, and you will find many. Unfortunately, it's quite a common tactic for vendors who have sold perpetual software to make extra money from their existing client bases. Now, the way that you can prevent an audit cost, firstly, look at what administration options you have. So see what kind of visibility you're going to get so that you can get that visibility before the vendor. Have you got some way of checking how many install, how many access devices are using the software? That's tip one. Tip two, can you control? So some terminal emulators will give you an access key that actually prevents you physically from going over. So if you've purchased 500 concurrent sessions, when that 501st session tries to come online, they will get a message saying no seats are available, please contact your IT department. That is a way that you can ensure you will always be fully audited and fully compliant, and not paying potentially hefty audit fees. Also, when choosing your vendor, look at their audit track record. Are they a vendor that is historically making a significant proportion of their revenue via audits? And if so, what can you do to prevent yourself getting caught in that? Maybe choosing a vendor that's got a less aggressive audit strategy is a better long-term objective to save you that cost. Something that's really important, especially at the moment in the emulation market, is security. Well, especially in the macro market that we're in as well, security is really important. The average cost of a data breach at the moment has risen from $3.86 million to $2.24 million. That's the average cost. So that's going to completely dwarf any potential savings you could have from maybe using an emulator with less impressive security credentials. Also, from an insurance point of view, you may think that's not going to be a problem for me. I don't particularly hold that budget for the security data breach, but there will not be insurance to cover you. I'm working with a number of clients at the moment indirectly who are looking to move emulators because they have been given notice that their insurance will not cover them for an emulator that relies on Internet Explorer as the access, because obviously that's going to be deprecated. So after June, their insurance becomes invalid. So that's something you have to be aware of. It may not be that the breach occurred through the emulator, but mandating the use of those out-of-date browsers can cause issues beyond the emulator and leave your organization quite vulnerable. You can also have external SLAs with your customers. So if your customer is required to use your terminal emulator and your terminal emulator requires a piece of deprecated software, then you are passing that potential litigation and insurance risk onto your customer and giving yourself another potentially hefty fee there. So when looking at total cost of ownership, something really need to be aware of and make sure that your organization is protected, because no one wants to be responsible for that particular problem. Also, terminal emulators are not created equal when it comes to productivity and revenue potential. Anyone that has ever used one will know this. I'm always astounded when I go into some of our customer sites and see how quickly some people can key through those screens. And if your emulator is actually the slowest part of the machinery, then that is stopping productivity in those organizations. If you have to go through, for example, loading a special app or loading different apps to go onto different parts of the application, for example, or if the screen and you just have lag, that is for some of the processes that require multiple screens going to across all of your users, cost the business significantly. Whether they will have visibility of that or not, only you know. Also, training. So onboarding someone and teaching them to use the terminal emulator. Staff turnover, as we all know, is quite high at the moment. So if it takes you a long time to onboard and teach someone how to use a terminal emulator, that is going to be a cost center. If there are ways that you can speed that up using your terminal emulator, for example, macros, screen concatenations, modernization, which comes onto our augmentation options. If you can maybe move multiple screens into one, make clickable buttons rather than using the function keys, all of that is going to reduce the onboarding and reduce the time to value and the total cost of your emulation solution. You've also got the impact on your offering in the wider market, because if you are providing access to your customers Those that are maybe not as aware of the efficiencies of the mainframe or the IBMI may wonder why your organization has got the green on black technology, or why there is such a convoluted path, or why you're using outdated applets or plugins to access these business critical systems. So it does have impacts on your brand and your revenue potential as well, which all need to be taken into account when making that emulator choice.